Welcome back to our class on world religions, and today we are going to look at Islam. I'm sorry for the late start, which means it's going to be a slightly later end, but we'll try to keep it interesting. As always, I welcome your comments and questions at the end of our talk today. Islam is where we are at today. It's the youngest of the major world religions. It is the second largest religion in the world. There are almost approximately 2 billion adherents of Islam, and it is the youngest of the 3 Abrahamic religions. Just to remind us that the anchor date in Judaism is generally considered to be the birth of Moses, which happened in 1526 BC. Jesus was born in roughly around 4 BC. I know that's interesting, Jesus before Jesus, but 4 BC. And Muhammad comes on stage in around 570 AD, of the Common Era. In order for us to understand Islam, and hopefully over the course of our talk today, dispel some of our misconceptions about the religions, because in many ways Islam is one of the least understood religions, especially by the West. We need to understand a little bit of what life in the Middle East, specifically in Arabia, was before the coming of Muhammad and the beginning of Islam. So if you can picture the Middle East and roughly imagine where Saudi Arabia is, there is this city called Mecca, about 70 miles inland from the sea. And this particular area, as you can imagine, was and is now arid, waterless, sandy, empty, and at that particular time, incredibly impoverished as a part of the world. It had interesting trade links, so there were Arab settlers who would trade based in Mecca. And Mecca was already a very special place because it was the seat of the Kaaba. The Kaaba is this rectangular block that today sits in the middle of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, and it had an import way before Muhammad and the beginning of Islam, because the Kaaba is this big, gigantic rectangular block in which there were all kinds of idols of deities that were placed inside this particular rectangular block. The understanding that Muslims have is that Mecca was the place where Abraham first agreed to sacrificing his son. Going back to the book of Genesis, we know that Abraham, who had been childless for the longest time, finally his wife Sarah gives birth to Isaac, this much longed for son, and God calls him to sacrifice his son in order to display his loyalty to God. The understanding is that this is where Abraham actually built the altar to sacrifice his son. Jews and Christians will say his son Isaac. Muslims will say his son and legitimate heir, and the heir of the covenant or the promise of God, who is Ishmael. So that's where the division occurs. We believe that the promise that God made to Abraham was made through his marriage to Sarah, who then becomes Sarai, who then becomes Sarah, and the name of that son is Isaac. Muslims believe that it was not Isaac who was the son of the promise, but if you remember your Old Testament a little bit in the book of Genesis, When Abraham was childless for the longest time and Sarah felt that her womb had closed up, she offers her handmaid, her servant, to Abraham to sleep with so that she could give him and the heir that he longed for. And the name of the woman that Sarah gives to Abraham is Hagar. And the child of Hagar is Ishmael. Not the one from Moby Dick, but Ishmael. And so Muslims believe that the promise that God made to Abraham actually went to Ishmael. And the story is that in the Kaaba, if you remember the story of Abraham, takes Hagar, his concubine. He has a child through him, and then Sarah gets very jealous and essentially asks him to kick Hagar out, and Hagar goes out into the desert and there she desperately longs for water, but her son Ishmael rubs the heel of his foot in the sand and water spurts out of there, and so that is where this Kaaba is built. So by the time of Muhammad, which is around the 6th century AD, Mecca was already a place that was considered to be sacred, and Arabs from all the known area around would go to Mecca to do pilgrimage. And so Mecca had this religious significance, and it is in this particular city that Muhammad is born. He is born of the tribe of the Qurayshis. It was a prominent clan amongst the Arabs, and he belonged to this prominent clan. However, he was a very impoverished young man. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was less than 8 or 9 years old. And the structure of the society at that time was deeply tribal. And we get some information about this by looking at documents, contemporary documents that tell us about the intense rivalries between different tribes of that particular time. Some people have equated the sense of tribal rivalry, vengeance, the longing for vengeance, the sense of outrage because somebody back in the past, some ancestor of one particular tribe committed an atrocity against another tribe, and that desire for vengeance and that sense of animosity between tribes lingered for generations. They say, not unlike some of the stories you hear of the mafia and of parts of Sicily and Italy. It's comparisons that are generally made. I understand that might not be very fair. But into this particular area, Muhammad is born around 570 AD. We are told that he was a deeply spiritual man, deeply impoverished. However, as he grew up, he was married off to a woman named Khadija. And it is said that Khadija was maybe around 40 years old when Muhammad was just 25. But marrying Khadija increased his social acceptance because she was a wealthy widow who ran a major business in the city of Mecca. Around the age of 40, we are told that Muhammad, who would go out into the desert and in particular caves around Mecca to meditate upon God because he was a deeply devout spiritual man. And it was in one of these visits around the age of 40 that he encounters the angel Jibreel. As he's known in Islam, we know that angel to be Gabriel. And this particular angel comes to Muhammad and he holds him down violently and asks him to recite Muhammad is not able to read or write because he was completely illiterate, but as the angel emphasizes for him to speak, to recite, he begins to utter words that are given to him. And these are called the major revelations of Allah to Muhammad. And these revelations go on to become what we know as the Quran. I know I'm spelling it differently, but it's technically it's Quran, which goes on to become the holy book. And the major emphasis that the Quran brings to the understanding of Muhammad and his people is that whole notion of monotheism, that there is only one God in a culture in pre-Islamic times that was largely polytheistic. There were many gods who were worshipped at that time. There were tribal, local gods and gods that were worshipped. But Muhammad declares that God is one. And so the Quran's overwhelming emphasis on the singularity and uniqueness of God above any tribal gods was radical. But it was not as if the Arab culture of that particular time was unaware of monotheism, because there were Jewish people living in the area. In fact, there was a city then called Yathrib, which is about 300 miles north of Mecca, and this was a largely Jewish settlement. You know, we studied earlier when we talked about Judaism of the many diasporas that happens of Jewish people fleeing to different parts of the world to avoid persecution. There was a large Jewish community in Yathrib, and it is an important town because we'll come back to it in a little bit. Muhammad receives this revelation from God. He comes up with the Quran. He returns to the city of Mecca and immediately begins to preach. Muhammad saw himself as a prophet in the same tradition of the Jews and the Christians. Muhammad saw himself as a prophet in the same line of Abraham, of Moses, of Elijah, of Isaiah, of Jesus, who is also considered to be a prophet in Islam, and that he, Muhammad, is the last of the prophets. This is the final revelation that he said he was bringing to God's people. And so Muhammad preaches primarily to the Jews, also to the Arabs, and says, I am the fulfillment of all your deepest longings and yearnings because God has spoken to me. Muslims have a very high understanding of Jesus, that in fact Muhammad was a sinful prophet, whereas Jesus, even in Islam, is considered to be the sinless one. The problem that Islam has with Jesus is the same problem that Jewish people have with Jesus, which is he was special, he was unique. However, he cannot be the Son of God, because that whole business about being the Son of God messes with the essential tenet of the religions of both Judaism and Islam, which is God is one. In fact, the primary verse, the Shahada, which is like the Shema for Jewish people, the Shahada basically declares that God is one and Muhammad is his prophet. Josh tells me that I say this too often, but the Shahada is La illallah Muhammad il Rasulillah. God is one and Muhammad is his prophet. That basic understanding about the nature of God is really important to the early Muslim communities of that time. Coming back, preaching the good news of the prophethood of Muhammad, he begins to invite the pagan polytheistic Arabs to the oneness of God. And he preaches to the Jewish people, and he says, I am the fulfillment of all that you have been waiting for, And in fact, this new community that he forms begins to worship facing Jerusalem, because he believed that Jerusalem was the central, focal, sacred religious point of worship. And so he invites his devotees to worship God facing Jerusalem. But unfortunately, he is not very successful at being able to win a lot of converts. And frankly, Muhammad is astonished that Jewish people would not accept his prophethood and his prophecy. And so he finds that as his popularity in Mecca is diminished, he ultimately leaves Mecca, travels 300 miles north to the Jewish city of Yathrib, which gives him refuge, and there he sets up his new religion. It was also a religion that was deeply connected to his tribe, and there was no religious movement without a political movement. So essentially, this city of Yathrib is renamed the city that we now know as Medina, which literally simply means the city. And if you ever travel in the Middle East, you find there's a Medina in every city, which is like a main focal point in the middle of the city, which is called the Medina. And so Medina literally means just the city, but it is in Medina that he establishes a community that becomes also a political entity. And as he does that, this particular movement of his from Mecca to Medina is called the Hijrah. It's spelt in different ways. The movement from Mecca to Medina is called the Hijrah, which happens in 620 AD, and that is when the Muslim calendar begins. So the movement from Mecca to Medina becomes a chronological sheet anchor, if you will, and it is from that particular date, the 16th of July, 620 AD, that the Muslim calendar begins. It's a lunar calendar, and so it is not always in sync with the Julian calendar that we follow. And so when Muslims think about a date, not unlike the Jewish people who also have a different way of dating than the Christian calendar, their year begins in 620 AD. The establishment of his community in Medina ultimately leads him to also become a political and a military leader. And several years later, Muhammad goes back with his armed forces into the city of Mecca, which rejected him, and establishes his new religion as well as this new political entity of Muslims in the city of Mecca. Islam, if you look at the rest of the Middle East, became a fast-growing religion. Within 100 years of Muhammad's life, we see that most of the Middle East has turned to Islam. Because it was a religion that was powered by a political military group, it was essentially militant at its very heart. The idea was that when you carried a bunch of soldiers into a strange land and invited people to convert to Islam, you were giving them no choice. You were saying, basically, accept Islam or die. I'm not suggesting that people were not genuinely convicted in the faith. Yes, I'm sure many were. But there was also a clear Muslim pressure on communities that were largely polytheistic, something that Muhammad rejected at the core of his beliefs. And so Islam spread from Saudi Arabia into Yemen, into parts of Palestine, further east, all the way into Iran, Iraq, Syria, North Africa. Much of this, within 100 years of Muhammad's life, had converted to Islam. We will come to the basic fundamentals of the faith of Islam in a little bit, but After Muhammad dies, having established a kingdom as well as a flourishing religion, he dies without an heir. And so there are two brands of successors who are generally agreed upon. One is his good friend, Abu Bakr, who also is his father-in-law. He marries several women after his first wife, Khadija. Abu Bakr, actually his name is Abu Bakr, who becomes the successor to Muhammad. But a rival to Abu Bakr is his own son-in-law, who is Ali. And so there is a major point of contention that happens as to who is the actual successor to Muhammad. And that is what leads us to a major split in Islam that we all know today as the Sunni-Shia divide. The Sunnis are the ones who believe that Abu Bakr was the inheritor of the mantle from Muhammad, whereas Ali, his son-in-law, is followed by the Shias. Now, at that particular time, in contemporary time, immediately after the death of Muhammad, this was not as large an issue as it became later on. And later on, the divide between the Sunnis and the Shias was more than just about who you accept as the inheritor of Muhammad's mantle. It also led to a tremendous theological and, as we see, a geographical divide between Sunnis. So, majority of Muslims around the world are Sunnis, but a sizable minority are Shias, and they're often geographically located in different places. We'll come back to the Shia-Sunni divide in a little bit, but let's consider some of the core beliefs of Islam and how they stood in contradistinction to the pagan polytheistic Arab culture that was present in pre-Islamic Arabia. The first is one God. Jews proclaim that, Christians proclaim that, Muhammad proclaimed that. But Muhammad was preaching in a very polytheistic, very pagan culture. And essentially, the oneness of God becomes an important theme, just like it is for Christians and for Jewish people. Secondly, there's a belief in angels. Having been grabbed hold of by the angel Gabriel, there's a significant belief in the presence of angels all around us that Islam believes in. There's a belief in the holy book, the Quran, which was given to Muhammad in the lingua franca of that place, in Arabic. And so people who want to study the Quran have to learn Arabic. If you go into a Barnes and Noble, no, we are done with Barnes and Noble or Borders, but if you were to walk into a bookstore and look at the Quran, either it will be in Arabic and it will be called the Quran, or if it is translated into English or any other language, it will be called the interpretation of the Quran. The understanding being you cannot study the Quran except in Arabic, which is why there are madrasas or places where young Muslims who wish to be trained in religion and law of the Quran essentially have to learn Arabic, which is why today there are Arabic schools everywhere, because you cannot study the Quran without understanding or being able to speak and write Arabic. Another core belief is the prophets. As I said, Muhammad saw himself in the same line of prophets that have informed the Jewish faith and therefore the Christian faith. But a belief in the prophets, and the fact that every prophet that is recorded in the Jewish Bible as well as in the Christian Bible are necessarily seen as prophets, including in New Testament times, not only Jesus as the prophet, but before him, John the Baptist is seen by Muslims as a prophet too. So there's a strong sense of connection that Muhammad tries to build in between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But ultimately, because the Jewish people rejected Muhammad, that he then turns from worshipping in the direction of Jerusalem to worshipping in the direction of Mecca. You remember, I mean, if you've caught an international flight at any time, if you fly one of the Gulf airlines, Saudi Airlines or Emirates, there will always be an indicator on your little display as to which direction Mecca is in. And because it's necessary, if you are going to follow the faith and pray 5 times as you're required as a good Muslim, that you always need to know which direction Mecca is in so that you can pray appropriately. Another fundamental belief of Muslim people is in the day of judgment. Really important. When I was speaking about Hinduism, I was saying that there is a cyclical nature to Hinduism. When you are caught in a cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth, you necessarily see history as cyclical. Whereas Judaism and Christianity and Islam are not cyclical in their understanding of the unfolding of the faith, but they see life as linear. There is a beginning of the world, as in the creation. There is an intervention by God in sending Abraham and Moses the prophets, sending Jesus as a prophet, sending Muhammad as a prophet. But that ultimately, this world as we know it is going to come to an end. It's a belief that is shared by Christians and Jewish people as well. Judaism continued to be a religion that was much smaller, and Islam, as I was saying, spread so far out to the east and then ultimately, of course, to the west. As I was saying earlier, within 100 years, Syria, Jordan, as we know it, countries today, Turkey, all became Muslims, all the way into Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. All of those stans are also predominantly Muslim countries. Today, the largest number of Muslims live in the Asia-Pacific region. You know that the country with the largest Muslim population, Indonesia, which has roughly around 240 million adherents of Islam. The second most populous Muslim country in the world is Pakistan. Just before India, Pakistan is at 231 million and India has a population of 213 million. So there is a huge shift. When we typically think about Muslim countries, we tend to think about the Middle East. We think about Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. These are predominantly Muslim countries, but their populations are nothing like Indonesia and India and Pakistan. There is a strong Muslim presence, of course, in the Middle East, but hardly 20%. They account for only about 20% of the Muslims around the world. This comes as no shock or surprise to any of you that there are growing Muslim populations in the West. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Spain was overrun by the Muslims. The Spanish language has so much Arabic influence in it. When you travel in Spain, you see minarets sticking out. You see ancient mosques that are still visible in parts of Spain because of the more than 800-year Muslim rule over Spain. But increasingly in the 20th century and the 21st, we have seen a tremendous growth of Muslim communities, primarily in Britain and in Germany, largely due to migrations from parts of North Africa and the Middle East. There have been growing communities of Muslims, and of course, here in the United States, we have a fair number of growing Muslim communities as well. I said there's a divide between the Sunnis and the Shias. So the Sunnis largely are in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Turkey, and in Indonesia. These are Sunni Muslim dominated communities. The Shias, the largest Shia country in the world, Iran. Iran is a sort of a flagship leader of the Shia community. But there are also Shia minorities in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Bahrain, and in Yemen, which is a largely Shia country. I was saying that there are deep theological differences between the Sunnis and the Shias, and I was saying that they didn't begin with theological differences or patterns of worship which are different, but they evolved over a period of time when the animosity between the Sunnis and the Shias continued to grow. Both Sunnis and Shias adhere to what are called the 5 pillars of Islam. These 5 pillars make up an important aspect of worship amongst the, I'm sorry, I've lost my way, so give me a second. The first is called the Shahada, which is the declaration, which is that there is only one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That Shahada is what is the declaration is the first thing that a newborn Muslim child hears in his or her ear as soon as the mother has given birth. The earliest time that they want to present that. The second is called Salat, or it's also called the namaz, which is prayers. Typically, you are expected to pray 5 times a day as a good Muslim. And if you happen to be traveling in some Middle Eastern countries, you'll find that at 5 different times over the course of the day, everything comes to a standstill and people begin to pray. During the season of Ramadan, we happened to be in Dubai at that time, and it was interesting because it's the holy month of Ramadan and the prayers become that much more special that 5 times a day, there are streets that would shut down, shops that would be shuttered, and people would sit down, would kneel in the middle of the road and pray. In parking lots, in gardens, in parks, people would bend down and begin to pray because it is such an important part of their worship. The third is what is called in Arabic as zakat, which is almsgiving, which is giving money to the poor is a necessary fundamental part of one's faith. And so Muslim charities play a very important role in the ongoing propagation as well as maintenance of the faith. Another aspect of that 5 pillars is Ramadan. In India and the South Asia, this is called Ramzan, but it is the 40 days of fasting that happens before the celebration of Eid al-Adha, a major feast. Ramadan is a holy month, and because it depends on the lunar calendar, it shifts from time to time. And so during Ramadan, fasting is an important part of one's expression of devotion to God. And the fasting is pretty severe. There is no food, no drink, And in fact, people are not allowed to even swallow, because that is seen as not fasting. And so a strict adherence to that notion of fasting means that when the Eid chand, when the moon is sighted at the right time, the Imam declares as to what is the right time for one to break one's fast. So I lived in Bombay for several years, and in a Muslim neighborhood that I lived in, the city would be, and parts of the city would be dead. If Bombay, city of 29 million people, can ever be called dead, but it would sort of slow down. But at night, as soon as the Imam had declared that this is a time when you can break your fast, there would be an eruption in the market. Food stalls will be open, there would be festivities happening in the middle of the night, and people would go out to eat. Following the Ramadan, not unlike the Christian Lent, is an important part. And finally, the fifth of the pillars is called the Hajj, which is that every practicing Muslim is expected to travel to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. And this particular travel to Mecca, of course, makes Saudi Arabia and Mecca a really important plus, because as I was saying, Mecca has been a pilgrimage center for, more than 2,000 years, well before Islam was formulated. But then, since it's become one of the 5 pillars, people travel to Mecca. Many who can afford it go back every year, but at least once in a lifetime, one is expected as a Muslim to go to Mecca. Living in Bombay, there would be certain times of the year, spring and summer typically, when there would be hordes of new ships sailing from the port of Bombay towards Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia makes tremendously elaborate arrangements to host millions of people who come during one particular time of the year to commemorate the Hajj. It is such an important aspect that if you have been to the Hajj, you are given the title of a Haji, as in someone who has completed the Hajj. It's a badge of honor you put before your name, as someone who has been to the Hajj, has fulfilled that particular promise that is required of every Muslim. And so to be a Haji is important. It's very interesting. When American soldiers attacked both Iraq and Afghanistan, they would derogatorily call all Muslims as Hajis. If you watch movies about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was this disparaging way in which all Muslims were called Hajis by American soldiers. The 5 pillars make up this particular aspect, and the Hajj has this elaborate ritual that you have to go through. You know that Saudi Arabia's economy is hugely dependent on oil, right? It's an oil-rich country. It was a desperately impoverished part of the world before oil was struck, and something that the West was never interested in. But when they developed oil, they found oil and they began to mine it. Of course, there was a lot of interest from the Western world as well as from the Far East, because oil means wealth. Saudi Arabia has worked very hard towards trying to diversify its portfolio away from oil, because it is a resource that is going to end at some point, quite apart from all the problems we have with fossil fuels in our world today. But just to give you a sense that after the oil industry, the second largest industry in Saudi Arabia is tourism. And literally by tourism, and by tourism I mean primarily tourism, religious tourism, specifically as in the Hajj. Islam itself, the word means submission. The word means submission. Allah is in some ways hard to understand. He is capricious and has his own will. We don't always know how he will act. And I can never be sure of being saved as a Muslim, because that takes away from Allah his sovereignty. And so my job as a Muslim is to be completely submissive to Allah. So Islam means submission. There's a sense that it could also come from the word salam, which means peace. Muslims, when they greet each other, say salam alaikum, which means peace be upon you. Every time they refer to the Prophet Muhammad, if you read about him in Islamic literature, there'll always be Prophet Muhammad within brackets PBUH, which stands for peace be upon him. Because he was a holy representative of God, he is accorded that stature where he is never referred to simply as a prophet. He's always referred to as Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So Islam could derive both those senses, that it's a religion of peace, as well as a religion that calls for utter and total submission to God. Unlike most of our understanding, there is a lot of diversity in the Islamic community. We often in the West tend to see Muslims as a monolithic group of people, and that couldn't be further away from the truth. They are people who are very different. For instance, if you sit with someone who's from Iran and someone who's from Saudi Arabia, the differences are vast, even though they both call themselves Muslim. As I said, people from the Arabs are largely Sunni, though there are Shia minorities around there. And one of the ways in which you insult an Iranian is to ask if they are Arabs, because they are not Arabs. People from Iran are not Arabs. Not all Muslims are Arabs. The Iranians are very proud of their culture, Persian culture, which has a long, ancient history of domination when they came to rise soon after Alexander. So they date way back. But also because Farsi, the language of Iran, is very distinct and different from Arabic. They learn Arabic because that's the only way you can understand or read the Quran, but they are very proud of being a distinct people. Turks are not Arabs, and they get really angry if they are ever addressed to as Arabs. The Arabs who live largely in Saudi Arabia and in Syria, in Jordan, and parts of North Africa are a distinct racial group. However, one of the interesting things is that one of the phrases we hear a lot about in our times today is the phrase anti-Semite, which typically means critical of or against Jewish people. Whereas the stark reality is that the Muslims and the Jews are both Semitic people. They belong to a similar grouping of people, and yet the phrase anti-Semite or anti-Semitic is seen as specifically being a critique of Jewish people, which is not really true. So there's a diversity of worship. In fact, apart from the Sunni-Shia divide, for instance, this young new mayor-elect of New York City, whose name neither our president nor the former governor of New York could ever pronounce correctly, Zohran Mamdani, is a Khoja. Now, his people are called the Khojas, and the Khojas are a Shia group of people who migrated way back when from Iran to the west coast of India, and because they were part of a trading community, they have had old ancient links to Africa, And so there are Khoja communities who are a subset of the Shia faith who are found in Uganda, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Botswana. And it is there, from there, that Mamdani's father comes from, and how he ultimately ends up marrying a Hindu woman, Meera Nair, a film director, and Mamdani becomes the mayor-elect of New York. My intention of saying all of this is that there is tremendous diversity in worship. Amongst the Shias, for instance, I was saying earlier that the Shias and the Sunnis split up soon after Muhammad's death over the issue of who was actually the legitimate successor of Muhammad. But amongst the Shia communities, one of the most important festivals or holy days for the Shias is called Muharram. And in the month of Muharram, it's a 30-day commemoration of Allah. Within Muharram, there's a day called the Ashura, which literally means the 10th. That on the 10th day of the month of Muharram, Shia Muslims break out into the streets. You see them all over parts of the world. I would see them in Bombay, where there would be processions of young men, hundreds deep on major streets in Bombay, carrying chains and knives, beating themselves on their back, and spewing blood in the streets because they are commemorating the assassination of one of the successors of Ali all the way back in 800 ADs. So that sense of a very violent reflection of their faith and an expression of their devotion to Allah is expressed in the streets of in many parts of the world. There is also a major group called the Sufis. The Sufis are basically mystical Islamics. These are men and women who celebrate what might be equated with the Pentecostal movement amongst Christians. So there's a lot of emphasis on the mystical. In India, there is a particular form of singing called joy, called the Qawwali, which is a particular devotional song that is, or a style of song that is sung as an expression of Sufi worship. The Sufis were largely a rural movement, people who did not understand the essence of their Islamic faith too well began to subscribe to a mystical union with God. And so there is a charismatic movement within the Sufis. They often dance and sing sometimes without provocation. You know, there'll be a large Muslim gathering and there'll be a few people who'll get up and begin to dance in the middle of a circle, and suddenly you find hundreds of people have joined them instinctively singing and worshiping God, not unlike hardcore charismatic or Pentecostal movements here in the United States, where a charismatic expression of faith is almost a requirement for them. Today, we also see that there is a tremendous shift that's happening in Islam, especially because of globalization and access to technology. A lot of Islam today is slammed because of what we would call religious fundamentalism, which is clearly rising, and they've been abetted by this tremendous access to technology. We've heard of movements like Al-Qaeda, who are able to recruit primarily using technological tools to incite young men and women from various parts of the world, including the West. You hear some horror stories of how after the Taliban was first defeated by the American forces, they found a lot of people from Britain, from Germany, who had left everything and gone to fight for the cause, for the Muslim establishment of something called a caliphate. A khalif is a religious leader. And as I was saying, dating all the way back to Muhammad's time, there was a clear sense that politics and religion not only did mix, that they were deeply intertwined. That Islam was not just a religion, it was the establishment of a kingdom. And the head of that kingdom would be the caliph, sometimes spelled with a KH, or a religious leader who was also a military commander of his people. So that's what ISIS and Al-Qaeda tried to do, which is to establish a kingdom that invokes Muhammad's sense of the deep integrity between religion and politics. Last night I was at dinner with some Persians, and I found out that of all the places that might be named after the Caliph, I haven't done enough research in it, so that'll wait for another time, is that because of Spanish influence on the United States and of a tremendous Islamic influence on Spain, that the very state we live in is actually named after the Caliphate. Like I said, I haven't done enough research yet. I haven't had much time to. I'm sure there are plenty of Spaniards who will reject that, and plenty of Californians. But there might be a sense that the establishment of a Khalifat, a rule that is Islamic as well as military, is really important, which leads us to, how much time do I have? Okay. To, again, another important notion, which is the Sharia. The Sharia typically just simply means the law. The Quran is the holy book of the Muslims. It's accompanied by a book called the Hadith, which is a kind of a commentary on the Quran, which actually collects a lot of sayings of the prophets. And there's a deep sense of morality that is integral to Muslims. And so the establishment of a Sharia law for parts of the world where there are Muslim-dominated places is important. Like in Iran, where women are prevented from displaying their hair in public. It goes back to ancient Arabic cultural norms where women were mostly sequestered and in hiding from the outside. But this sense that we have to return to the holy days when we had truly had Sharia law in place is a movement that has grown, not only in Iran, but in Saudi Arabia, where until very recently, the women were not allowed to drive until Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince, allowed for that to happen. But now we have movies, and we have, so we see a lot of change that's happening in Saudi Arabia and amongst other Muslim countries. The other word that is often misunderstood is the word jihad. Jihad literally means the struggle. It simply means struggle. Yes, it is sometimes translated into holy war, which is what the Muslims did to defend themselves from the Christians who crossed through Europe to fight for what we call the Crusades. The Crusades, as we saw a few weeks earlier, was an attempt to Christianize the Muslim Middle East so that Jerusalem could be freed, and so that holy place for Christians and for Jewish people would be free of the Muslim scourge. Well, Crusade and jihad are almost sort of similar seen from different parts of the world, which is jihad can mean simply the struggle, and the struggle literally means is how does one live a faithful Muslim life in the changing times of today can be part of your jihad. But of course, we see the word primarily as a call to arms, like by places in like ISIS or and Al Qaeda and other Islamic fundamentalist groups. We are living in a time when we are seeing a greater divide between the West and Islam. This has been a divide that's been present historically, and today we are seeing it amped up in dangerous ways in which the West and the Muslim world sees each other as enemies. And we are living in a time when the call to a greater understanding of people who follow a different faith is necessary. And that's why, as Christians, we need to be engaged in understanding the other so that the other will not be someone who is vilified like Islam often is and adherents of Islam often are by Christians, but for a common understanding, which is why I commend to you Building Bridges, which is going to happen in March next year, when we will have Jewish, Christians, and Muslim people coming together under the auspices of this of Building Bridges to help us understand some of the essence of how faith is lived out in each of our communities so that we'll have a greater understanding of each other. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Yeah. Sorry, can you speak up? He had, correct. He had a daughter named Fatima who plays an important role, especially among Shia Muslims. So the question was, how come Muhammad didn't have an heir? He had a son-in-law, so he must have had a daughter, which he did. But the daughter would have had less of a position or the possibility of leading a religious group. So the son-in-law Ali was seen by the Shias as the inheritor of the father's mantle. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Joy? Sorry? Ali Khan, you mean the Aga Khan? There is an Aga Khan. There always has been in a very small Shia group. So Joy is talking about one more of the subsects amongst the Muslims called the Aga Khan. This is a group, part of a group called the Ismailis, who are a small sect within the Shia community, and they follow a pretty progressive, modern version of Islam. And Prince Aga Khan, who died a few years ago recently, has a young successor to the religion, but his sphere of influence is in a very small community, largely found in India and in small parts of Europe. Yeah. Sorry?
I work in technology.
Okay.
So I use technology to, open people's mind. So I created a chatbot. I'm following up on what you said. And lastly, how people are not open-minded. There's more conflict. So the chatbot is called godstranslator.com.
Godstranslator.com.
Yeah. You can ask any question anonymously, and you get free responses from three Abrahamic religions, so Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So the idea is if you belong to one of them, you see the other two, and the responses are not that different. So maybe that'll create more harmony in the world.
Awesome.
I wanted to mention that since you talked about increasing conflict among these three religions, so I'm doing something about it.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? Yeah. Then, as a closing, let me just remind us that over the past 5 weeks, we've studied to the extent that we can actually study a religion in a 1-hour class. We have gone through Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, today Islam. And next Sunday will be our last class. And we are looking next Sunday at religious fundamentalism, which, as you know, is not restricted to the Muslims. We have a pretty strong religious fundamentalist growth here in the West, specifically in the United States. So we'll be thinking a little bit about next week about what gives rise to fundamentalism. What does it mean to be a religiously fundamentalistic people? And how do we understand what the future is going to look like if we continue in this particular strand of looking? And I think we will be paying fair attention to fundamentalist movements of other faiths, but I would like to look at our own Christian evangelical or fundamentalist brothers and sisters, and the way in which Christianity needs to become, in my understanding, more progressive, more generous, more liberal in the best sense of that word, so that we can be a force for unifying and unity rather than division. Thank you very much. Have a great week.